New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 2-part series on physics and the soul. With me is Dr. Fred Alan Wolf, the author of Taking the Quantum Leap, which won the National Book Award in Science. Fred is also the author of 8 books dealing with physics and consciousness, including Space, Time, and Beyond, The Eagle's Quest, Parallel Universes, and most recently, The Spiritual Universe. Welcome again, Fred.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
We've been discussing the many different cultural traditions that address the soul and your effort to reconcile these various traditions with modern science. And it seems to me that the heart of your argument rests on the idea that basically there would be no science at all if there weren't conscious beings, observers, to create science.
I believe that's a very important requirement, and I think that one of the problems that we're having with a materialistic-based science or a causal-based science is that we don't take into consideration elements which are, I think, a part of modern physics and a part of ancient spiritual belief systems. Things such as a soul, things such as a spirit, things such as messages from the future, teleology, purpose. Mm-hmm. These are questions which are part and parcel of spirituality, which are left out of materialistic based science. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have a reason to deal with time in a different way in modern physics because of Einsteinian relativity saying that there's no such thing as absolute time. So, and modern physics, quantum physics, saying that things from the future can affect us by the movement of this thing called a wave function, quantum wave of possibility. Since we have these things, I don't see why we insist in science and constantly trying to base our discovery, our insight on causality and materialism when we already know from quantum physics and relativity that these things don't work.
Mm-hmm. Well, isn't it possible, though, that a very positivist-oriented scientist might turn around and say to you, well, what about Buddhism? Here is a spiritual tradition that denies the existence of the soul altogether, that actually Buddhism represents a form of spirituality which might be consistent with conventional modern science.
You know, it's easy. I could understand how one might get that impression. I also have studied Buddhism and read whatever writings I could which were indicative that the Buddha actually said these things and not just interpretations of Buddhism. And my feeling is that the Buddha talked about consciousness and the soul in a certain way. I think there was one famous story in which a wanderer comes into the village where the Buddha is sitting, and this wanderer had been around before and had asked the Buddha questions. Yeah. And
Vacchagotta, as I recall.
Vacchagotta, right. And so Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha and says, "Is there a soul?" And the Buddha says nothing. And then he says, "Well, is there then no soul?" And again the Buddha says nothing. And then Vacchagotta, after sitting 5 minutes with the enlightened one, gets up and walks away. And finally one of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha friends, comes up to him and says, "Why didn't you tell him? Why didn't you talk to him? What are you holding up back for?" And the Buddha said, "I didn't tell him because, you see, if I would have told him that there was a soul, then he would say I was siding with all of those Brahmayanas and recluses who believe that the soul is the only way to salvation." If I would have sided, and then again, if I would have sided with those that said no soul, then he would think I was siding with all the nihilists and all of those other guys that say there is no soul. And if I would have told him, if I would have answered any of the questions, he would have thought, well, possibly I had a soul, but now I don't have one, and so I don't want to. I didn't want to confuse the fellow. And so the Buddha taught basically is that I answer the question to that person at that moment, very much a quantum event. It's not a question of establishing a fact based upon anything he might have said before.
Yeah.
For the Buddha, the most important thing was the experience, what's happening now, be here now.
And yet the Buddhists subscribe to the theory of reincarnation, the transmigration of the soul from body to body, and they have a very interesting way of integrating that idea with the idea that there is no soul.
Yes, this is rather remarkable. I remember once asking one of the great Buddhist lamas at a conference on spirituality, what are you guys talking about? How can there be reincarnation without a soul? And he looked at me and said, that is an interesting question. And so then, as I studied it, I realized that their concept of the soul is like they see tendencies to come into being, and that there might be what I think they would agree on, archetypal tendencies to come into being. They call these skandhas or khandhas. Aggregates of coming into being. There's different ways of describing this. Yeah. So when I looked at that, I said, Jesus is very impersonal. There's no personal being that comes into being, but there's something impersonal that comes into being. So even though Fred Wolf might be something which is here at the moment, the Fred Wolfness will be always here, or the Mishloveness will always be here in the universe as that tendency of consciousness acting in the way that it acts through you and through I. And I think this is what the Buddha was really referring to, a tendency to come into being, and that's what reincarnates. And I think this is pointing very well to what I call soul.
They use the metaphor, I believe, of passing a flame from candle to candle.
Yes, I was going to mention that. In a wonderful movie called Little Buddha, in fact, Rinpoche, I think it was Sogyal Rinpoche actually plays in the movie.
We've had the opportunity to interview in the past.
And he's a wonderful actor. I mean, he's very believable. And somebody asked him, well, what do you do about the soul? He says, well, let me show you something. He took out 2 candles, and he said, you see this candle and this flame? And he said, yes. When the candle burns down, the flame can extinguish. But if I take the flame and pass it on to the other candle, then the other candle lights. And he said the flame is like the soul. It's always the same, but yet it's never the same. And that made me think that really what he's talking about is the impersonality of soul. And I think this is the most fundamental, most important idea for Western spiritual and modern science belief systems to incorporate, because I think it really points to a true bridge, a true solidity, which both can rest on.
You've also written about how the Dalai Lama himself, the Tibetan Buddhist spiritual leader, has suggested that the soul of a human being could actually perhaps pass into a computer, and that this idea is consistent with the writings of another modern physicist, the cosmologist Frank Tipler.
Yes, I have to tell you, when I first realized that the Dalai Lama was saying this, I myself was shocked. I was almost affronted by it. It's like you don't really know what you truly believe until someone throws it right in your face. And this, wow. I keep thinking the body is holy, and suddenly here's Dalai Lama saying, why not in a computer? And he actually did say this. He believes that he was curious about computers and he wanted to know how they worked. And when Francisco Varela, who had written a book about his interviews with the Dalai Lama,
we might mention Varela himself as an outstanding biologist,
an exobiologist, and a thinker about self-organization and biological systems. When that Dalai Lama asked him what goes on inside of computers, he said, well, it's not so much what the computer is made of that's important, it's the processing that the computer is doing that's really the important thing. And so at that moment, the Dalai Lama did a double take and said, well, then it's possible for consciousness to enter into a computer. Maybe the person who created the program could be in that computer. And this does tie in very well with physicist Frank Tipler's model, the physics of immortality, and his thinking about that the universe is a great big, in a way, light show, which ultimately will end in a virtual reality of such stupendous magnitude, just at the final moment at the end of the universe, that all of us will be resurrected again as virtual reality computer programming on a nanosecond time scale, so that what will appear to be 1 nanosecond will be like 1 second to us, and in the last billionth of a second, it'll seem like eternity to us, and all of us will be reborn and relive again. Well, whoa! I mean, it's mind-boggling to even say it. It's mind-boggling to think about it. But I think that Tipler and the Dalai Lama would have agreement here.
And there's a sense in which Tipler's viewpoint is not terribly inconsistent with the Christian theology of the resurrection.
No, it isn't. Frank Tipler, I think, very much is a Christian, I think, and I believe that he was attempting seriously, although many people might have panned him for this, to model how Western science might envision the process. But there's something in Tipler's work that's missing, and I think this is what caught my attention. And what's missing may sound like an egoic statement. I'm not in Tipler's book. Now, I don't mean Fred Wolf. I mean the sense of I presence. How does I presence? I mean, can I, when this resurrection occurs, am I going to know self as I know it now? Tipler doesn't address this issue.
Subjective awareness.
Subjective awareness, exactly. Tipler doesn't address this issue, and I think it's an important issue, and it's one that I do address.
Well, that's the problem that philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. It's the one that most scientists in particular, and philosophers also, tend to avoid. It's easy to talk about cognitive processing and little pieces of how we do this and that, but the very existence of experience, of subjective awareness is the tough one, and it is the one that quantum physics seems to address by virtue of the observer.
You know, it's so astonishing to me. Why should subjectivism or subjective physics be tough? And the answer is, it isn't. So what makes it tough? Well, it's very tough if you're trying to take the subject out of the subject and put it as an object. That's tough. I mean, that can't be done. That's the problem. So if you're trying to objectify subjectivism or the subjective inner knowing that one has, that's very difficult to do. Yet, in spite of the difficulty of that, there are writings today by scientists like David Deutsch, who is a noted physicist at Oxford University, by David Albert, who is a noted philosopher, I think he's at Columbia, but I'm not sure where he's located right now, who have written about this problem and have said that it's possible to show that its computer automaton could be constructed using principles of quantum physics, theoretically at least, in which these automata are capable of making a distinction between themselves and the outside world. And I thought that's mind-boggling. I mean, here we have maybe the first beginning of an objective subjectivism or something like that. And so I was very excited with that idea, and I used it in my previous writing on the dreaming universe, and it also plays a part in my current thinking about the spiritual universe.
And here is where you have some very interesting arguments based on quantum physics for the existence of the soul. They're a little bit tricky. I don't know if we want to get into the full extent of your logic here, but I think it might be worth pointing out that what you argue is that when it comes to the soul, when it comes to consciousness, there's just one.
Yes.
And we all partake of it.
Yes, this is very interesting. Ludwig Boss, who was a physicist at the University of Queensland in Australia and also a student of Erwin Schrödinger, the father figure of quantum physics, who discovered the famous Schrödinger wave equation, pointed out a proof of why there can only be one mind. And he gave this proof in a journal and presented it very, very clearly. And he said he was establishing what Schrödinger had always believed was the foundation of Vedanta theory, which says that there is only one soul or one mind.
Vedanta is Hindu philosophy.
And
Schrödinger, like many of the great quantum physicists, were deeply involved in this kind of thinking.
Exactly. So I think that when I went through the proof as carefully as I do, I try to establish using an example of robots and human beings. I try to make it as fun for the reader as possible to show why his proof works and why it seriously should be considered as proof that there's only one mind.
Well, it is tricky, but my sense of it from having read it is that basically what you're saying is that if we assume that the nervous system, that our brains follow the laws of quantum physics, as everything in the material world does, that then nobody would know anything.
Basically, we'd all be undecided. We'd be in the state of holding all possibilities in our consciousness. Nobody could choose to do anything, and we'd be essentially not even robots. We would just be stupefied. Wouldn't be able to move or do anything.
We would see clouds of probability everywhere instead of actual events occurring. And in our minds, we experience events one at a time. When we see something, we know this is what is happening. I am talking to Fred Wolf right now, not dozens of you scattered all over the room. So that there's something fundamentally in contradiction between our everyday experience of things and what quantum physics suggests actually exists.
Right. And it indicates that when mind enters, it doesn't enter in a local way. It's a non-local thing in a way. It's something which, by non-local, I mean it doesn't have an address at a particular point in time and space. So it can enter anyway, and it's essentially just one mind. It's not separate minds. It's when you try to posit separate minds that you come in conflict with this robotization problem.
Then you write about something which is really fascinating, which is the idea that here I am, I'm a self. This is Jeffrey. I'm Jeffrey, you're Fred. We exist in what you might think of as the small mind. This is me, and I believe myself to be conscious, and yet I'm involved in some kind of a dialogue on a subtle internal level with the great consciousness of the universe that embraces us all, and which gives me even the illusion that I'm more than a figment in my own imagination.
Yeah, it's very difficult to conceive of. I think the simplest model I can offer is consciousness is like water. It's like a great ocean, and each of us has drops of it, but we never ever lose sight of where we came from. We're always in the sea of consciousness. And actually the sea in this case is literally the vacuum of space. So it's that vacuum of space which is really the home of consciousness, and we're all connected to that vacuum of space, and that vacuum of space doesn't have an address. So I think it's that's the important.
And what you're saying is that the idea that the soul exists in no space at all, and in effect, is acceptable to modern physics.
It's acceptable to modern physics. It may be very unacceptable to people that insist on the soul being like themselves. There's this tendency to anthropomorphize everything, including soul, and therefore say that, well, the soul can only be a human soul. Well, it could also be an animal soul or a plant soul. I mean, soul is something which implies the consciousness which enters into life itself, and it seems to be a guiding principle. It's not something which is there to tell us what has happened to us in the past, but it's there to tell us what directions are available to us in the future.
In other words, well, what you write is that the soul is created by a kind of vibration in non-space, in virtual space, that is created with two vibrating points, one at the beginning of time, one at the end of time, so that it exists throughout all of time, and is trying to communicate to us, to guide us in our journey through this realm that we call time.
You can think of it as a gigantic jump rope from the beginning of time to the end of time. And you can think of two people both sending out waves by moving the jump rope up and down, you know, like kids do in a playground. If one of them moves the rope and the other one holds it still, the wave travels. If the other one shakes the rope and this one holds it still, it travels. They both shake at the same time, you get a standing wave, and then somebody can jump rope in between. We are the jumpers on this cosmic jump rope. And how high we jump and where we can jump to depends on where we are in time. And those of us that are more conscious are able to jump higher than those of us that are less conscious, that are still dealing with, proving our existence or surviving or doing destructive things unconsciously. So evolution is the story of this cosmic jump rope, and we are, all of us, consciousness is in all parts of the jump rope simultaneously from this point of view.
And so what you're suggesting here is the spiritual notion that we each receive guidance from a higher self or from a soul or even from God or something like that is consistent with your understanding of modern physics.
It's consistent with my understanding of modern physics. Now, I can't say that it's consistent with every physicist's understanding of modern physics.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we could argue about it, and it'll be probably fun to debate the issue in some way. But as far as I'm concerned, it's perfectly consistent with the basic notions of quantum physics and how quantum physics calculates the possibilities of things occurring in space and time.
Mm-hmm. And it's consistent with the esoteric traditions of the Kabbalah.
It's consistent with Kabbalah, with the notion of Aleph, the void, the great power, the potential able to be anything. It's consistent with the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
The Buddha also said there was a great void out of which the unborn, out of which the born must come. It's consistent with, I think, a number of different spiritual practices in theology, including Hinduism and even Vedanta.
Mm-hmm. And yet it's a view that is somewhat inconsistent with some of the classical Western ideas, such as Aristotle's teaching that the soul is a finer substance.
Yes. Aristotle did think it was a substance. He kind of hedged his bet sometimes too. I noticed that he would point out, well, is sharpness a quality which exists? And is a knife, a knife has sharpness as the body has a soul. So I think he was implying that the soul was a property of the material.
Yeah.
So again, he was always basing it, he was hedging his bet. He realized it wasn't noun-like, it was like sharpness. Sharpness is really not noun-like, it's adjectival or adverbial depending on how you use it. So I think he recognized some elements of the idealistic or the verbal non-noun-like character of soul, but at the same time it was always based upon on matter as a fundamental.
Yeah, at one point you write that Aristotle suggests the soul is like some sort of feathery gossamer substance, and some people think, yes, at death this ghost-like thing leaves the body, but your view is different than that, and it's also different from the point of view of people who suggest that the soul is an emergent property that develops because of the complexity of the nervous system in the body.
Yes, the complexity theorists and the people that are modeling, making, I think, good strides in computer modeling of complexity theory and so forth, are attempting to show how consciousness can emerge. And I can't see it at all. To me, it's a dead-end street. It's not going to emerge that way from my point of view or from my understanding of the way physics works. You do need something else. And if you don't include quantum physics in biology, you can't do biology correctly, in my opinion.
And so the issue here is whether consciousness is as fundamental to the universe as space and time and matter is, or even more fundamental perhaps, or whether it's some kind of an epiphenomenon that grows out of physical properties, just as one might say, well, digestion is a property of the stomach, sharpness is a property of a knife, consciousness is a property of the brain.
Yes, that's the way a materialist would argue, and it's a very prevalent argument, and one that holds a lot of adherence to it. But my point is that argument fails, and it fails because it doesn't take into consideration what quantum physics already tells us, and that basically you can't have a reality without a perceived reality. We know that. You can't really even formulate a reality without some idea about what that reality is going to be even before you formulate it. So it's the theory that decides what we can and can't observe. So if our theories keep constantly bringing us back into materialism and causality as the basis for reality, then I think we're barking up the wrong tree.
You seem to suggest in your book, The Spiritual Universe, that it would be a benefit to people to spend some time trying to listen to the voice of their soul, and that it speaks in strange ways to us across time.
The best advice that I could give on this, and I don't want to confuse people to think that I'm a spiritual, that I'm a rabbi or a spiritual teacher or whatever, although maybe some people might think that, is to recognize that the soul doesn't speak to us in the normal way that your friends or your associates might speak to you. The soul speaks to us as a guidance. And the best way to hear that guidance, to sense it, is to let go of your adherence to causal reality, to things which are there in front of you. You can see the soul in watching a child or communicating with a child or a very elderly person. You can sense the soul's presence when you yourself feel compassion for another person's suffering. Mm-hmm. These are, if you don't feel compassion, if you get no joy from children or from old people, then then you have a severe problem of soul loss. Mm-hmm. And this is something that should clue you that if you can't sense joy in a child or in an elderly person or feel compassion for another suffering, then you yourself are not getting the soul message. And when you begin to let go of whatever you're holding on to and relax and breathe and meditate or whatever you have to do, these natural messages will come to you.
There's a sense in which we and ourselves, or by which I mean the little self, we tend to get, you use the term addicted to matter, to life in this world, and the message we get from our soul comes from a larger
perspective. In black culture, music, soul is a very important idea, and what is important about it, because soul awakens you to your compassionate nature. And I think that's the message that we all need to be aware of in dealing with experiencing soul in our lives.
Fred Alan Wolf, it's been a pleasure sharing this two-part series with you on physics and the soul. We've covered quite a range, everything from the ancient Egyptian and Kabbalistic thinkers to some of the leading ideas in modern physics and cosmology. Fred, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Again, it's been a pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.